What's going on?
5515th Street.
What's going on there, ma'am?
"We have a kidnapping," Patsy Ramsey tells the dispatcher, her voice cracking with panic. "Hurry, please." The dispatcher's training kicks in immediately. Stay calm, get information, send help. But the voice on the other end of the line carries something that transcends standard emergency protocols, a mother's primal terror that her child has been taken. But this was not a kidnapping. 8 hours later, 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey would be found dead in the basement of her own home. The ransom note demanding $118,000 for her safe return lay on the spiral staircase where her mother had discovered it that morning. The money was never collected. The promised phone call from kidnappers never came. JonBenét had never left the house. The mathematics of the situation would become clear only in retrospect. At 5:52 a.m., when that emergency call was made, JonBenét had already been dead for approximately 4 to 6 hours. The supposed kidnapping was a fiction. The ransom note was theater. The real crime had concluded before dawn, while the family slept upstairs. What happened between 10 p.m. on Christmas night and 5:52 a.m. the following morning remains one of America's most analyzed unsolved cases. But here's what makes it particularly haunting. Every piece of evidence seems to point in a clear direction until you examine it more closely. Then, it points somewhere else entirely. Consider the contradictions that emerge when you layer the evidence chronologically. The ransom note suggested kidnappers who wanted money and planned to return JonBenét alive. But the autopsy revealed injuries that would have been fatal within hours long before any ransom exchange could occur. The ransom note was written on paper from inside the house using a pen from the kitchen. Practice drafts were found on the same notepad. What kidnapper breaks into a home and spends 20 minutes composing a theatrical 3-page letter? Yet DNA from an unknown male was found on JonBenét's clothing. Not once, but in multiple locations. This DNA doesn't match anyone in the family or anyone in law enforcement databases. The forensic timeline tells its own story. JonBenét's stomach contained pineapple, partially digested, indicating she had eaten it 1 to 2 hours before death. A bowl of pineapple sat on the kitchen table, bearing fingerprints from family members, but not from JonBenét herself. Someone had served her this snack, but who? The crime scene showed signs of careful staging. The basement window was broken, but spiderwebs remained intact across the opening. A suitcase sat positioned beneath the window as if used as a step, yet no clear footprints marked the path. Physical evidence painted competing pictures. The garrote around JonBenét's neck wasn't a simple ligature, it was a deliberate construction, fashioned from cord and a paintbrush handle found in the house. This suggested either a killer with specific knowledge of torture devices, or someone working from imagination and available materials. The family's behavior seemed suspicious to investigators. They hired lawyers immediately. They gave conflicting statements about the timeline, but their grief appeared genuine, and they cooperated with DNA testing and polygraph examinations. Each theory that attempts to explain what happened that night accounts for some evidence beautifully, while failing to address other crucial details. The case has consumed investigators, destroyed reputations, and divided public opinion for nearly 3 decades. Was this an inside job staged to look like an intruder crime? Or was it an actual intruder whose methods were so unusual they created the appearance of family involvement? The house at 755 15th Street stood quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. John and Patsy Ramsey had planned to wake early for a family trip to their Michigan home, then continue to Disney World with their children. Instead, Patsy woke around 5:30 a.m. to begin preparations for departure. Boulder in winter carries a particular silence, snow muffles sound, early mornings stretch longer, the cold creates a crystalline stillness that makes any disruption feel amplified. The Ramsey house, with its solid Tudor construction and thick walls, would have been especially insulated from outside noise. She descended the spiral staircase that connected the family's 3rd-floor master bedroom to the main level. On the wooden steps near the bottom, she discovered 3 pieces of white paper arranged in sequence. The handwritten pages contained what appeared to be a ransom note addressed to her husband. The placement of these pages would later become a point of forensic analysis. They weren't crumpled or hastily dropped. They were laid out deliberately, positioned where they couldn't be missed by anyone descending the main staircase. This suggested someone familiar with the family's morning routines who would come downstairs first, which path they would take. "Mr. Ramsey," it began, "listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves." The handwriting analysis would consume months of investigation. 4 expert examiners would study every loop, slant, and pressure variation. The letter formations showed characteristics consistent with someone trying to disguise their natural writing style letters that appeared forced, spacing that seemed deliberately altered. The letter demanded exactly $118,000 in cash, an amount that precisely matched John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus from Access Graphics, his computer services company. It specified denominations: $100,000 in $100 bills, and the remaining $18,000 in 20s. The note warned against contacting authorities and threatened that JonBenét would be beheaded if the family failed to follow instructions precisely. This financial detail would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence. John's bonus wasn't public information. It wasn't mentioned in newspapers or business publications. The exact figure would be known primarily to John himself, possibly Patsy, and select personnel within Access Graphics who handled executive compensation. Patsy ran upstairs to JonBenét's bedroom. The 6-year-old's bed was empty, covers pulled back, her absence immediately apparent. The timeline of this discovery would be reconstructed minute by minute. From finding the note to checking JonBenét's room to placing the 911 call took approximately 22 minutes. What happened during that interval? The family's account suggests panic and immediate reaction. But critics would later question whether 20 minutes was enough time to stage certain elements if a cover-up was occurring. The 911 call that followed would be analyzed thousands of times. Audio enhancement would later suggest that after Patsy believed she had hung up the phone, voices could be heard in the background, including what some experts interpreted as 9-year-old Burke asking, "What did you find?" If accurate, this contradicted the family's statement that Burke had slept through the morning's events. The enhanced audio became a forensic battleground. Some experts insisted they could clearly distinguish 3 voices. Others argued the sounds were inconclusive, possibly equipment noise or unrelated household sounds. The FBI's audio laboratory reached no definitive conclusion about what the recording contained. Officer Rick French arrived at 5:59 a.m., 7 minutes after the emergency call. He entered a house that should have been treated as a crime scene, but instead became a gathering place for family, friends. Fleet and Priscilla White arrived, followed by the Fernies and Reverend Roll Hoverstock from the family's church. Within hours, more than a dozen people had moved through the rooms, potentially contaminating evidence. The decision to allow friends inside reflected the investigation's initial assumption this was a kidnapping, not a murder scene. Standard kidnapping protocol focuses on managing the family's emotional state while waiting for contact from perpetrators. Securing forensic evidence takes secondary priority when the victim is presumably still alive elsewhere. But this assumption created irreversible consequences. Every person who entered left traces fiber transfer from clothing, skin cells from touching surfaces, footprints that obscured others. The pristine crime scene that might have preserved crucial evidence was destroyed within hours. Detective Linda Arndt took charge around 8 a.m., but found herself alone, waiting for backup that was delayed. The ransom note had specified that kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 a.m. with delivery instructions. 8 o'clock passed without contact. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, the silence stretched on. The psychological pressure in the house became intense as the deadline passed. Family, friends tried to maintain hope while privately wondering why the promised call never came. Legitimate kidnappers typically make contact precisely when promised delays suggest problems with their plan or questions about their authenticity. At 1 p.m., more than 7 hours after the 911 call, Detective Arndt asked John Ramsey and Fleet White to search the house once more for anything unusual. They headed to the basement, checking Burke's train room and storage areas. Then John opened the door to the wine cellar, a small room at the far end of the basement. "Oh my God," he screamed. JonBenét lay on the concrete floor, covered with a white blanket. Black duct tape sealed her mouth. A white cord was tied around her neck, fashioned into a garrote with a broken paintbrush handle. Her hands were loosely bound above her head with more cord. The moment of discovery would be etched permanently in the memories of everyone present. Fleet White, standing behind John in the doorway, saw the body immediately. Detective Arndt, hearing John's screams from upstairs, knew instantly that the case had transformed from kidnapping to homicide. John immediately tore away the tape and lifted his daughter's body, carrying her upstairs to the living room. His instinctive paternal response destroyed critical crime scene evidence, the position of the body, the arrangement of items in the room, potential trace evidence that might have identified her killer. The contamination was now complete and irreversible. The crime scene that should have been photographed and processed in its original state was forever altered. Investigators would never know exactly how JonBenét's body had been positioned or what items might have been arranged around her. Detective Arndt checked for vital signs and found none. JonBenét had been dead for hours, her body already rigid with rigor mortis. What had begun as a kidnapping case was now a murder investigation. But the crime scene had been fatally compromised. The basement room where Officer French had conducted his initial search that morning, walking past the wine cellar without turning on the light or fully entering, contained evidence that would never be properly preserved. The child who should have been found within an hour of the 911 call had instead lain undiscovered, while potential evidence was destroyed by well-meaning family and friends moving through the house. The Ramsey home was a sprawling Tudor-style mansion built in the 1920s, purchased by the family in 1991. 15 rooms spread across 7,000 square feet created a complex layout with multiple staircases, hidden storage areas, and a basement maze that would become central to investigators' theories. Understanding the house's architecture becomes crucial to evaluating competing theories. The main living areas occupied the first floor kitchen, dining room, living room, den. The second floor contained bedrooms for the children and a guest room. John and Patsy's master suite occupied the entire third floor, accessible by the spiral staircase where the ransom note was discovered. The basement itself defied simple explanation. Burke's train room occupied one section, filled with elaborate model railway tracks. The boiler room housed mechanical systems. Storage areas contained seasonal decorations and household items. At the far end, past several turns, sat the wine cellar, a small, windowless room where JonBenét's body was discovered. Crime scene mapping revealed the complexity of reaching the wine cellar from any entrance point. An intruder would need to navigate multiple turns, pass several other rooms, and locate a specific door among many options. This suggested either extensive prior knowledge of the layout or considerable time spent exploring during the crime. The broken basement window became a focal point of investigation. John Ramsey explained he had broken it months earlier when locked out of the house, but crime scene analysis raised questions about when the break might have occurred. Some glass shards lay on top of undisturbed dust and debris, suggesting recent damage. Other evidence indicated the break was older. Forensic glass analysis attempted to determine the timing of the break. Glass fragments found inside the basement showed weathering patterns inconsistent with recent damage. But other shards appeared fresh, their edges sharp and unmarked by exposure. The evidence pointed in both directions simultaneously. A suitcase positioned beneath the window appeared to have been used as a step, yet the window well outside remained filled with undisturbed leaves and debris. If an intruder had entered through this window, they had somehow avoided leaving clear traces of their passage. Investigators conducted experiments to determine whether entry through this window was feasible. Detective Lou Smith, who later became convinced an intruder was responsible, demonstrated that an adult could fit through the opening. But fitting through and actually entering without disturbing the surrounding area proved more challenging. The basement also contained the materials used in JonBenét's murder. The white cord around her neck came from hardware store rope, but no source roll was ever found in the house. The paintbrush handle in the garrote came from Patsy's art supplies, broken in half with the bristle end discovered elsewhere in the basement. The duct tape came from a roll that was never located. This pattern of missing source materials raised questions about preparation and planning. If an intruder brought these items, why use materials found in the house? If family members were involved, where did the remaining cord and tape go? The absence of complete rolls suggested either careful disposal or that only specific amounts were brought to the scene. Upstairs, the kitchen table held a bowl of pineapple with a serving spoon. This seemingly innocent detail would become crucial evidence, as pineapple was found in JonBenét's digestive system. Based on digestion rates, she had eaten the fruit approximately 1 to 2 hours before death. Yet both parents insisted she had fallen asleep in the car, returning from a Christmas party, and had been carried directly to bed without eating anything. The forensic analysis of digestive timing became complex. Different experts provided slightly different estimates based on various factors: the amount consumed, individual digestive rates, the presence of other foods, but the consensus pointed to consumption between 10 p.m. and midnight, during hours when the family claimed JonBenet was asleep. Burke's fingerprints were found on the bowl, along with Patsy's prints on the serving spoon. JonBenet's fingerprints were not detected on either item. This suggested she had eaten pineapple served by someone else, contradicting the family's timeline of events. The fingerprint evidence raised additional questions. If Burke had served himself pineapple, why were Patsy's prints on the spoon? Had she served both children? Had she cleaned up after Burke and then left the bowl on the table? The positioning of prints suggested multiple people had handled these items, but in what sequence? The ransom note itself had been written on a legal pad kept near the kitchen telephone. The black felt tip marker used to write it came from the same area. After composing the note, the writer had returned the pen to its holder. Crime scene investigators discovered practice drafts in the notepad. Someone had started writing Mr. and Mrs. R before tearing out the page and beginning again with Mr. Ramsey. Handwriting experts noted that the practice start suggested uncertainty about how to address the recipients. Mr. and Mrs. R would be more formal and distanced. Mr. Ramsey was more personal, almost conversational. This detail might indicate the writer's relationship to the family close enough to use first names, but formal enough to maintain distance. The note consumed 2.5 pages with 370 words, extraordinary length for a ransom demand. Most genuine kidnapping notes contain 5 to 10 sentences at most. This letter rambled through multiple paragraphs, included movie references, and adopted an almost theatrical tone. Phrases like, "Don't try to grow a brain," echoed dialogue from the film Speed, while the overall style suggested familiarity with crime thrillers. Linguistic analysis revealed educational markers in the writing. Despite attempts to sound threatening and unsophisticated, the vocabulary and sentence structure suggested someone with substantial formal education. Words like attaché instead of briefcase and complex conditional clauses indicated familiarity with business and academic language. The $118,000 demand seemed both specific and personal. It wasn't a round number like $100,000 or $500,000. It closely matched John's recent bonus from Access Graphics, information that wouldn't be public knowledge. How would a random intruder know this figure? The specificity extended to the denomination requirements. Why demand exactly $100,000 in hundreds and $18,000 in 20s? Real kidnappers typically care only about receiving money, not its specific configuration. This level of detail suggested either someone with particular knowledge of banking procedures or someone creating artificial complexity to appear more professional. What kind of kidnapper spends 20 minutes inside a victim's home writing a practice draft of their ransom note? What kind of murderer carefully returns the pen to its proper place after using it to compose a theatrical letter? What kind of intruder knows intimate family financial details but leaves behind their own DNA? Within hours of discovering JonBenét's body, investigators began focusing on the family. This wasn't unusual. Statistics show that children are far more likely to be harmed by family members than strangers. But the evidence pointing toward family involvement went beyond statistical probability. The behavioral analysis began immediately. How do innocent parents react when their child is murdered? How do guilty parents behave when trying to appear innocent? These questions have no simple answers. But investigators look for patterns that seem inconsistent with genuine grief and shock. The ransom note presented the strongest argument for inside knowledge. Written on materials from within the house, it demonstrated familiarity with John's business and recent bonus amount. The practice drafts suggested someone comfortable enough to sit down and revise their approach. No intruder would risk spending that much time in an occupied home writing and rewriting a ransom note. Consider the logistics of note composition. Finding the notepad and pen required knowing where Patsy kept household supplies. The writer needed sufficient light to see while working, but not so much as to wake sleeping family members. They needed confidence that they wouldn't be interrupted during the 20+ minutes required for drafting and revision. Handwriting analysis couldn't definitively exclude Patsy Ramsey as the note's author. 4 experts examined her writing samples compared to the ransom letter. 2 said they couldn't eliminate her. 2 others deemed the evidence inconclusive. While no expert stated definitively that Patsy wrote the note, the similarities were notable enough to fuel suspicion. The handwriting evidence presented competing interpretations. Characteristics that some experts viewed as matches could be explained as common letter formations taught in American schools. Features that seem deliberately disguised might indicate someone copying another person's writing style rather than attempting to hide their own. The pineapple evidence directly contradicted the family's account of that evening's events. If JonBenét ate fruit 1 to 2 hours before death, and if she died around midnight to 2 a.m., then she was awake and downstairs between 10 p.m. and midnight. This meant either the parents were mistaken about her going straight to bed, or they weren't telling the truth. Memory research suggests that trauma can affect recollection of events immediately preceding a crisis. The family might genuinely misremember JonBenét's activities that evening, particularly details that seemed unimportant at the time. But investigators had to consider whether the contradictions indicated deception rather than confused memory. The family's behavior also raised questions. They hired prominent defense attorneys within days of JonBenét's death and limited their cooperation with police. John and Patsy didn't sit for formal interviews until April 1997, 4 months after the murder. When they finally agreed to be questioned, they came with conditions, separate interviews, lawyers present, limited time, certain topics off limits. Legal experts argue this behavior was prudent given the investigation's clear focus on family members, but the perception of non-cooperation created suspicion in the media and public opinion. Innocent parents might reasonably hire attorneys when they realize they're being treated as suspects rather than victims. This created an adversarial dynamic between the family and investigators. Police interpreted the legal maneuvering as evidence of guilt. The Ramseys saw it as protection from a department they believed had already decided they were responsible. The psychology of the interviews reveals additional complexity. John appeared calm and controlled during questioning, which some interpreted as suspicious emotional detachment. Patsy was more visibly distressed, which critics characterized as theatrical overacting. Both responses were seen as evidence of guilt by those predisposed to suspect them, but the family theory faced significant problems. The DNA evidence presented the most serious challenge. Male DNA found on JonBenét's underwear didn't match any family member. When touch DNA technology advanced in 2003, additional testing found matching male DNA on her long underwear. Finding the same unknown profile in 2 locations made innocent transfer less likely. The DNA evidence forced family theory proponents to explain how unknown male genetic material ended up on the victim's clothing. Theories ranged from contamination during manufacturing to transfer from medical personnel to planting by the real perpetrator. But each explanation required additional assumptions that complicated the family involvement scenario. The brutality of the crime also argued against family involvement. The garrote around JonBenét's neck wasn't a simple ligature. It was a deliberately constructed device requiring time and knowledge to create. Could a parent or sibling create such a weapon and use it on a family member? Psychological studies of family violence suggest that when parents kill children, the methods typically reflect either sudden rage, beating, shaking, or attempts to make death appear accidental or natural smothering, poisoning. The elaborate staging and torture device, in this case, seemed more consistent with sexual predator behavior than family violence. The staging argument cut both ways. If family members discovered JonBenét injured and decided to cover it up, would they create such an elaborate scene? The garrote, the duct tape, the ransom note, all of it seemed like enormous effort and risk. Why not simply call 911 and claim an accident? But staging might serve specific purposes beyond simple misdirection. Creating an obviously staged scene could focus investigation on intruder theories while leaving enough inconsistencies to prevent definitive conclusions. A sophisticated staging might be designed to create exactly the kind of confusion that has characterized this case for decades. The grand jury that heard evidence for 13 months in 1998 to 99 voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, but not for murder. The charges were child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. The indictment language suggested the jury believed someone in the house had killed JonBenét and that the parents had helped cover it up, possibly to protect their surviving child. Reading the grand jury's language carefully reveals their thinking. They didn't conclude that John or Patsy directly killed JonBenét. Instead, they believed the parents had unlawfully, knowingly, recklessly, and feloniously permitted a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation which posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health, which resulted in the death of JonBenét Ramsey. District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictment, believing the evidence wouldn't support conviction at trial. The charges remained secret until 2013, when court documents were finally unsealed. Hunter's decision reflected prosecutorial reality. Grand juries hear only evidence presented by prosecutors and operate under a lower standard of proof than criminal trials. What convinces a grand jury to indict might not persuade a trial jury to convict beyond reasonable doubt, especially when defense attorneys can present contrary evidence and expert testimony. What do you make of a grand jury that heard all the evidence concluding the parents were involved in a cover-up, but a prosecutor who decided the case wasn't strong enough to bring to trial? The DNA evidence forms the cornerstone of the intruder theory. Male DNA from an unknown source was found mixed with JonBenét's blood in her underwear. Additional testing in 2003 revealed matching DNA on her long underwear waistband. This wasn't just trace contamination, it appeared in multiple locations, suggesting direct contact. The technical aspects of DNA analysis become crucial to understanding this evidence. The initial 1,997 testing used methods that required relatively large biological samples. The male DNA found on JonBenét's underwear was sufficient for basic profiling, but limited in detail. Advanced techniques available by 2003 could extract genetic information from much smaller samples. In 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacy formally exonerated the Ramsey family based on this DNA evidence. Her letter stated, "The match of male DNA on two separate items of clothing worn by the victim at the time of the murder makes it clear to us that an unknown male handled these items. There is no innocent explanation for its incriminating presence." Lacy's decision reflected developments in DNA science and criminal investigation. Finding matching DNA profiles in multiple locations significantly reduces the probability of innocent transfer. The statistical likelihood of the same person's DNA appearing on both items through coincidental contamination approaches, mathematical impossibility. But DNA evidence alone doesn't resolve the contradictions that make this case so puzzling. If an intruder killed JonBenét, how do we explain the ransom note written on materials from inside the house? How did this person know John's exact bonus amount? The intruder theory requires reconstructing a complex sequence of events. Understanding how an outsider could gain intimate knowledge of family finances and house layout while leaving minimal physical evidence demands examination of multiple scenarios. One possibility: The intruder had been inside the house before. The Ramseys had hosted a Christmas tour for local families just weeks before the murder. Hundreds of people walked through their home, including the basement. Contractors and workers had also accessed the house throughout 1996 for various projects. The Christmas tour becomes particularly significant when considering the basement layout. Visitors were shown the main living areas, but also given glimpses of Burke's elaborate train room in the basement. Someone with criminal intent might have memorized the layout while appearing to admire the holiday decorations. Someone familiar with the layout might have hidden inside during the Christmas party on December 25th, waiting until the family returned home and settled into sleep. This would explain knowledge of the house's complex basement and the location of JonBenét's bedroom. The logistics of hiding in the house present both opportunities and challenges. The 7,000 square foot home contained numerous closets, storage areas, and seldom used rooms where someone could conceivably remain undetected for hours. But the family was actively moving through the house that evening, preparing for their trip and engaging in normal domestic routines. The broken basement window provided a potential entry point. Despite John's explanation that he had broken it months earlier, some evidence suggested more recent damage. The window was found open, and a scuff mark on the wall below appeared fresh. But the window evidence presented its own contradictions. The spider web across part of the opening remained intact, suggesting no recent passage. However, the web was positioned in a corner rather than directly across the opening. An agile person might have avoided disturbing it while squeezing through. An unidentified boot print was discovered in the basement near where JonBenét's body was found. The print came from a high-tech brand shoe that didn't match any footwear owned by family members or friends who had been in the house. An unidentified palm print was also found on the wine cellar door. These trace evidence discoveries became significant markers of possible intruder presence. The boot print appeared fresh, lacking the dust accumulation that would indicate longer presence in the basement. The palm print was positioned at shoulder height on the door frame, consistent with someone pushing the door open. The ransom note, while unusual for an intruder, might represent an original kidnapping plan that went wrong. Perhaps the intruder intended to take JonBenet from her bedroom, but encountered problems, she woke up and screamed, or she struggled and was accidentally injured. With the kidnapping plan failed, the note became misdirection, designed to buy time for escape. Consider the psychological profile required for this scenario. The intruder needed confidence to remain in the house for extended periods, knowledge to locate JonBenét's bedroom in the dark, and composure to write a lengthy ransom note after committing murder. This suggests someone with either criminal experience or unusual psychological makeup. But the intruder theory struggles with several major problems. The ransom note's length and detail remain difficult to explain. What kidnapper spends 20 minutes writing a practice draft inside a victim's home? The specific bonus amount seems like information only someone close to the family would know. The financial information presents the greatest challenge to simple intruder theories. John's bonus amount wasn't discussed at social gatherings or mentioned in casual conversation. It appeared on private financial documents and payroll records. How would an outsider gain access to this data? Possible explanations include eavesdropping on private conversations, accessing documents during the Christmas tour, or obtaining information through employment connections. But each scenario requires additional assumptions about the perpetrator's knowledge and planning. The crime scene staging also doesn't fit typical intruder behavior. The garrote was carefully constructed using materials found in the house. The duct tape was applied after death, serving no functional purpose. The loose wrist bindings appeared more symbolic than practical. These details suggest someone trying to create a specific appearance rather than someone focused on committing a crime and escaping. Behavioral analysis of sexual predators indicates they typically focus on assault and escape rather than elaborate staging. The time and effort invested in creating theatrical elements seems inconsistent with standard predator behavior patterns. The pineapple evidence remains problematic. If JonBenet encountered an intruder in the kitchen and was given fruit before being attacked, why weren't her fingerprints on the bowl? How did only Burke and Patsy's prints end up there? This detail forces intruder theorists to explain how JonBenét consumed pineapple without handling the bowl or spoon herself. Perhaps she was served while still sleepy or compliant. Perhaps the intruder cleaned the bowl afterward but missed cleaning the spoon. Each explanation requires additional assumptions. Advanced DNA technology offers new hope for the intruder theory. Genetic genealogy, the technique that identified the Golden State Killer, could potentially trace family connections to the unknown DNA profile. If distant relatives have submitted DNA to ancestry databases, investigators might build a family tree leading to the perpetrator. The genetic genealogy process involves uploading crime scene DNA profiles to databases containing millions of civilian genetic profiles. Computer algorithms identify potential family relationships, allowing investigators to construct family trees and narrow down possible suspects. But genetic genealogy requires sufficient DNA for analysis, and the JonBenét evidence contains only trace amounts. After nearly 30 years, degradation may have reduced the sample below usable thresholds. Current estimates suggest the available DNA samples contain between 100 to 200 nanograms of genetic material. Genetic genealogy typically requires at least 1 to 2 micrograms for reliable analysis. The gap between available and required material presents significant technical challenges. Which explanation better accounts for the totality of evidence, family involvement with planted DNA, or intruder involvement with inexplicably intimate knowledge? The Boulder Police Department faced an unprecedented situation on the 26th of December, 1996. As a college town with relatively low violent crime rates, Boulder rarely dealt with child homicides. The department lacked experience handling cases that would attract international media attention and had no protocols for managing crime scenes that doubled as family gathering places. Boulder's crime statistics underscore the department's inexperience with major cases. The city averaged 1 to 2 homicides per year, typically domestic disputes or drug-related violence. Child abduction and murder were virtually unknown. The last comparable case had occurred more than a decade earlier. The first critical error occurred within minutes of Officer French's arrival. Instead of securing the house as a potential crime scene, friends and family members were allowed to enter freely. More than a dozen people moved through the rooms during the first hours, making coffee, using bathrooms, and sitting in various areas while trying to comfort the distraught parents. Standard police procedure calls for immediate scene control regardless of the apparent crime type. Even in kidnapping cases, the victim's home should be treated as a potential crime scene until proved otherwise. Evidence preservation takes priority over family comfort, but this principle wasn't applied. Every person who entered contaminated the potential evidence. Fibers from their clothing mixed with possible perpetrator traces. Their DNA mingled with biological evidence that might have identified the killer. Their footprints obscured others that could have provided crucial information. The contamination wasn't limited to trace evidence. Witness statements became corrupted as people shared information and theories. Independent recollections merged into collective memory, making it impossible to determine what individuals actually observed versus what they learned from others. But the most devastating failure was Officer French's incomplete search of the basement. When he opened the wine cellar door around 6:15 a.m., JonBenét's body lay just feet away. He looked into the darkroom briefly, but didn't turn on the light or step inside. The door was latched from the outside, and French assumed no one could be inside a room secured in that manner. French's decision reflected reasonable assumptions based on incomplete information. A latched door typically indicates an empty room, but his training should have emphasized thorough searches regardless of apparent logical contradictions. The possibility of staged evidence demands systematic examination of all areas. Had he discovered the body immediately, the crime scene would have been preserved. The position of JonBenét's body, the arrangement of items around her, trace evidence that might have identified her killer. All of it would have been documented before contamination occurred. Instead, the body remained undisturbed for 7 more hours while evidence was destroyed above. The preservation failure cascaded through every aspect of the subsequent investigation. Evidence that might have definitively established the perpetrator's identity, method, and timeline was compromised beyond recovery. The case transformed from a solvable homicide into an interpretive puzzle with no clear answers. Detective Linda Arndt found herself managing an impossible situation. Assigned to wait with the family for the promised ransom call, she was alone in a house filled with civilians. The kidnapper's deadline of 8 to 10 a.m. passed without contact, but department backup remained delayed. Other units were following leads based on the assumption this was a legitimate kidnapping. Arndt's isolation reflected broader departmental confusion about resource allocation. Multiple units were dispatched to follow kidnapping protocols while the potential crime scene remained understaffed. The investigation scattered its efforts rather than concentrating them at the most critical location. The investigation's focus shifted dramatically after JonBenét's body was discovered. What had been treated as a kidnapping became a homicide investigation, but the early decisions about crime scene management couldn't be undone. The damage was permanent. Standard homicide protocol calls for immediate scene isolation, systematic photography before any movement of evidence, and controlled access limited to essential personnel. None of these procedures were implemented because the investigation had begun with different assumptions about the nature of the crime. Within days, Boulder police began concentrating almost exclusively on the family. This wasn't necessarily wrong. Family members are statistically the most likely perpetrators in child homicides. But the focus became so intense, it resembled tunnel vision rather than thorough investigation. Tunnel vision represents a common investigative failure, where early theories become fixed beliefs resistant to contradictory evidence. Once investigators commit emotionally to a particular explanation, they unconsciously filter subsequent information to support their preferred theory while dismissing alternatives. Detective Steve Thomas later wrote that he became convinced Patsy Ramsey was responsible, believing she had struck JonBenét in a fit of rage over bedwetting and then staged the crime scene. His book revealed the extent to which investigators had committed to family guilt theories, while dismissing alternative possibilities. Thomas's conviction reflected psychological phenomena common in complex investigations. When faced with contradictory evidence, investigators often construct increasingly elaborate theories to maintain their initial assumptions, rather than questioning those assumptions. The result can be confirmation bias disguised as thorough analysis. The adversarial relationship between police and the Ramsey family made investigation exponentially more difficult. Instead of grieving parents and detectives working together to find a killer, the dynamic became accusers versus defendants. The family hired prominent attorneys who advised limited cooperation. Police interpreted this as evidence of guilt. Trust broke down completely. This adversarial dynamic reflects systemic problems in American criminal investigation. The constitutional presumption of innocence conflicts with investigative techniques designed to extract confessions from guilty suspects. When applied to innocent parties, these techniques create defensiveness that investigators interpret as suspicious behavior. Media coverage intensified the problems. Leaks from the investigation appeared regularly in newspapers and television reports, often containing inaccurate information designed to make the family appear guilty. Someone in the department was feeding reporters details that should have remained confidential, prejudicing potential jurors and witnesses. The media leaks represented a serious breach of professional ethics and legal procedure. Grand jury proceedings are secret by law. Evidence in ongoing investigations should remain confidential to preserve its integrity. The Boulder Police Department's inability to prevent leaks suggested either deliberate policy or systemic lack of control. The case became a media sensation rather than a criminal investigation. Tabloids offered money for information. Camera crews camped outside the family's home. JonBenét's participation in child beauty pageants provided endless material for sensationalized coverage that often had little connection to the actual crime. The transformation of tragedy into entertainment created additional obstacles to legitimate investigation. Witnesses became reluctant to speak with investigators, fearing they would become media targets. Evidence was discussed publicly before proper analysis, contaminating potential jury pools. Meanwhile, the DNA evidence sat largely ignored for years. When male DNA was first found on JonBenét's clothing in 1997, some investigators dismissed it as potential contamination from manufacturing or innocent transfer. The profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's criminal database, but generated no matches. The dismissal of DNA evidence reflected cognitive bias rather than scientific analysis. Investigators had already committed to family involvement theories, so evidence pointing elsewhere was minimized or explained away. This represents exactly the kind of tunnel vision that destroys investigations. It wasn't until 2003 when touch DNA technology revealed matching male DNA in a second location that investigators began taking the evidence seriously. Even then, opinions remained divided about its significance. Touch DNA analysis represented a revolution in forensic science. Previously, DNA testing required visible biological samples, blood, semen, saliva. Touch DNA could extract genetic profiles from skin cells left by simple contact with objects. This expanded the range of evidence available, but also increased the complexity of interpretation. The investigation consumed enormous resources while producing minimal results. Over 1,000 tips were followed up. More than 200 people were formally interviewed. The case generated thousands of pages of reports and evidence logs. But no arrests were made. Resource allocation becomes crucial in major investigations. The Boulder Police Department deployed virtually every available detective to this case, leaving other investigations understaffed. The financial costs exceeded $2 million in direct expenses, not including opportunity costs from diverted personnel. A grand jury spent 13 months reviewing evidence in 1998 to 99, ultimately voting to indict both parents on charges of child abuse, resulting in death and accessory to a crime. The indictment remained sealed when District Attorney Hunter refused to prosecute, believing the evidence was insufficient for conviction. The grand jury process involved 23 citizens hearing testimony from dozens of witnesses over more than a year. They reviewed thousands of pieces of evidence, consulted with experts, and deliberated extensively before reaching their decision. Their conclusion that charges were warranted contrasted sharply with the prosecutor's assessment. Hunter's decision satisfied no one. The family remained under public suspicion despite not being charged. Those who believed in their guilt felt justice was denied. The case remained technically open, but effectively stalled. Hunter's reasoning reflected the difference between grand jury and trial jury standards. Grand juries operate in secret, with relaxed evidence rules and lower burden of proof. They determine only whether probable cause exists for charges. Trial juries must be convinced beyond reasonable doubt, while defense attorneys present contrary evidence. How do you investigate a case where the crime scene was contaminated within hours, where the family and police became adversaries, where media attention destroyed any possibility of normal investigative procedures? The sealed indictment remained one of the case's best-kept secrets for 14 years. In 2013, when court documents were finally released, the public learned that a grand jury had indeed believed charges were warranted against John and Patsy Ramsey. The secrecy surrounding grand jury proceedings is designed to protect both the integrity of investigations and the reputations of individuals who might be cleared of wrongdoing. But in this case, secrecy allowed misconceptions about the grand jury's conclusions to persist for more than a decade. The specific language of the indictment was crucial. The grand jury didn't charge the parents with murder directly. Instead, they alleged child abuse resulting in death and accessory to a crime. The wording suggested the jury believed someone in the household had killed JonBenét and that the parents had helped that person avoid prosecution. Legal scholars note that these charges reflected careful consideration of available evidence. Direct murder charges would require proof that John or Patsy personally killed JonBenét. The accessory charges suggested the grand jury believed they had covered up someone else's crime, most likely their surviving child's. This language pointed toward their surviving child, Burke, who was 9 years old at the time of his sister's death. The theory that emerged suggested Burke might have struck JonBenét during an argument, possibly over the pineapple snack, and that the parents discovered the situation and staged an elaborate cover-up to protect him. Child psychology experts note that siblings between ages 6 to 12 commonly engage in physical conflicts that occasionally result in serious injury. The force required to cause JonBenét's skull fracture could potentially be generated by a 9-year-old using a heavy object like a flashlight or baseball bat. Under Colorado law, a 9-year-old cannot be charged with murder, regardless of the evidence. If Burke had been responsible, the parents would have faced an impossible choice: watch their surviving child enter the juvenile system, or create an alternative explanation that would direct suspicion elsewhere. The juvenile justice system in 1996 Colorado would have required Burke to undergo extensive psychological evaluation and potentially long-term institutional placement if found responsible for his sister's death. The family would have faced permanent stigma, and Burke's future would have been severely compromised. The grand jury heard testimony from numerous experts about the injuries JonBenét sustained. The head blow came first, causing a massive skull fracture that would have rendered her unconscious immediately. But she didn't die then. Medical experts estimated she remained alive but unconscious for 45 minutes to 2 hours before being strangled with the garrote. This timeline became critical to understanding what happened. Someone had nearly an hour, perhaps longer, to decide what to do about a severely injured child. Instead of calling 911, they chose to construct a ligature device and finish the job. The medical evidence suggested a progression that could support multiple theories. If Burke had struck JonBenét and she appeared dead, parents might have begun staging a break-in scenario. Discovering she was still breathing, they might have felt compelled to complete what they believed was inevitable death, rather than face investigation of the original injury. Could a 9-year-old create the garrote found around JonBenét's neck? Experiments showed that a child could generate enough force with a flashlight or similar object to cause the skull fracture. But the strangulation device required more sophisticated knowledge and deliberate construction. The garrote represented the most disturbing aspect of the crime. It wasn't a simple ligature that might be fashioned quickly in panic. The device was carefully constructed, incorporating a paintbrush handle as a tightening mechanism. Someone had taken time to create an efficient killing tool. Burke was interviewed multiple times in the weeks following his sister's death. Child psychologists found his demeanor unusual. He appeared remarkably untroubled by the tragedy, more interested in discussing his video games than his sister's murder. But experts noted that children process trauma differently than adults. His apparent detachment might have been a normal coping mechanism rather than evidence of guilt. Child interview specialists emphasize that normal responses to trauma vary enormously. Some children become withdrawn and silent, others become hyperactive or inappropriately cheerful. Burke's behavior, while unusual, fell within the range of normal responses to severe psychological trauma. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in June 2006, 2 years before the family was officially exonerated based on DNA evidence. She spent the last decade of her life under public suspicion, never living to see her name cleared. The timing of Patsy's death in relation to the DNA exoneration creates poignant irony. She endured a decade of accusation and suspicion, dying just as technological advances were beginning to point away from family involvement. Her final years were consumed by legal battles and public vilification. The 2008 exoneration by District Attorney Mary Lacy was controversial and remains disputed. Lacy's letter apologizing to the family and declaring that DNA evidence pointed away from their involvement wasn't accepted by all investigators. The Boulder Police Department publicly disagreed with her assessment, arguing that the DNA evidence, while significant, didn't necessarily prove an intruder's guilt. Lacy's decision reflected advances in DNA analysis and interpretation. By 2008, scientific understanding of touch DNA transfer had improved significantly. Finding matching profiles in multiple locations reduced the probability of innocent contamination to negligible levels. Critics of the exoneration pointed out that the DNA samples were extremely small, measured in picograms, and could potentially have been deposited through innocent transfer. The underwear JonBenét was wearing when found was brand new, never washed, and several sizes too large. DNA from manufacturing, packaging, or retail handling couldn't be ruled out. The debate over DNA interpretation highlights fundamental tensions in forensic science. Technology often advances faster than legal understanding of its limitations. Courts and juries struggle to evaluate evidence that requires sophisticated scientific knowledge to interpret properly. The case returned to Boulder Police Control in 2009, and investigators began re-examining evidence with fresh perspectives. Advances in DNA technology offered new possibilities, but also new complications. Each testing cycle consumed small amounts of the limited biological evidence, raising concerns about preserving enough material for future technologies. Sample preservation becomes critical in cold cases where DNA evidence is limited. Each analysis destroys some genetic material, creating tension between current investigation needs and future technological possibilities. Investigators must balance immediate testing against potential future breakthroughs. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, continues advocating for additional DNA testing and the application of genetic genealogy techniques. He's pushed for independent laboratory analysis and criticized what he views as decades of investigative failures. John's persistence reflects both a father's need for answers and frustration with institutional inertia. His criticism of police handling has been consistent for decades, focusing particularly on the initial crime scene, contamination, and subsequent tunnel vision. Burke Ramsey has largely remained out of public view, working in information technology and trying to live a normal life, despite ongoing speculation about his involvement. In 2016, he gave his first extensive interview, appearing on Dr. Phil to address theories about his guilt directly. Burke's decision to speak publicly after decades of silence reflected the burden of ongoing suspicion. His interview revealed someone who had spent his adult life dealing with accusations about his childhood involvement in his sister's murder. The CBS documentary, The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, which aired shortly after Burke's interview, explicitly promoted the theory that he had killed his sister and that his parents had covered it up. Burke sued for defamation, eventually settling the case for undisclosed terms. The documentary represented a significant escalation in public accusations against Burke. Previous speculation had been more indirect or theoretical. CBS presented their theory as fact, complete with expert testimony and reconstructed scenarios. The case has generated numerous books, documentaries, and television specials, each promoting different theories about what happened that night. The constant media attention has created an atmosphere where speculation often gets presented as fact, and where the line between evidence and theory becomes blurred. Media coverage has transformed the case from a criminal investigation into a form of entertainment. Each new documentary or book presents itself as revealing the real truth, while typically rehashing the same evidence with different interpretive spin. Meanwhile, the actual evidence sits in storage. Some of it degraded by time, some of it consumed by testing, some of it potentially compromised by the crime scene contamination that occurred in the first hours after JonBenét's body was discovered. Evidence preservation over nearly 3 decades presents significant challenges. Biological samples degrade naturally over time. Storage conditions affect the rate of degradation. Temperature fluctuations, humidity, and exposure to light can all compromise genetic material. What conclusions can be drawn from a case where a grand jury voted to indict based on evidence that a prosecutor deemed insufficient for trial? Nearly 3 decades after JonBenét Ramsey's death, the evidence can be organized into 2 competing narratives, each of which explains some facts while struggling with others. The passage of time has not brought clarity. Instead, it has deepened the mystery by revealing how the same evidence can support fundamentally different conclusions about what happened that Christmas night in Boulder. Door 1. Family involvement. Someone in the house struck JonBenét that night, possibly during an argument over the pineapple snack or some other typical childhood conflict. The blow was more severe than intended, fracturing her skull and leaving her unconscious and dying. The family discovered the situation and faced a terrible choice. The scenario requires reconstructing the family's decision-making process under extreme stress. Discovering a seriously injured child, they would have had minutes to decide between calling emergency services and facing potential criminal charges, or attempting to control the narrative through staging. Instead of calling 911 and risking the destruction of their remaining family unit, they decided to stage an elaborate cover-up. Patsy wrote the ransom note, drawing on her knowledge of John's bonus and her familiarity with crime films. They constructed the garrote and applied it to make the scene appear to be the work of a sadistic intruder. The note-writing process would have required approximately 20 to 30 minutes, during which JonBenét lay dying in the basement. The psychological burden of composing theatrical demands for her safe return while knowing she was beyond help creates a disturbing picture of calculated deception under extreme pressure. This explains the ransom note's insider knowledge, the lack of forced entry, the theatrical staging, and the family's immediate hiring of defense attorneys. The pineapple evidence fits someone in the family had given JonBenét the snack shortly before the fatal confrontation. The forensic timeline supports this scenario. JonBenét eating pineapple between 10 p.m. and midnight, then sustaining fatal injuries around midnight, allows sufficient time for the staging to occur before Patsy's 5:52 a.m. emergency call. But this narrative struggles with the DNA evidence. How did unknown male DNA end up on JonBenét's clothing? Why would a family create such a brutal staging when a simple accident story would have been easier to maintain? How could parents strangle their unconscious daughter to complete a cover-up? The DNA evidence represents the strongest challenge to family involvement theories. Finding matching male profiles in 2 locations on the victim's clothing requires explaining how this genetic material arrived there innocently. Theories range from manufacturing contamination to deliberate planting, but each explanation adds complexity to the family scenario. Door 2. Intruder involvement. Someone with knowledge of the house, perhaps gained during the Christmas tour or through work on the property, hid inside while the family attended their Christmas party. He waited until everyone was asleep, then went to JonBenét's room with the intention of kidnapping her for ransom. The intruder scenario requires explaining how an outsider gained intimate knowledge of family finances and house layout while avoiding detection during the initial phases of his plan. The Christmas tour provides opportunity for both knowledge gathering and scouting potential hiding places. The plan went wrong. JonBenét woke up or resisted and was struck during the struggle. The intruder thought she was dead and began staging the scene to cover his tracks. When he realized she was still breathing, he strangled her to eliminate the only witness to his presence. The progression from kidnapping to murder to staging reflects criminal adaptability under pressure. The original plan failing, the perpetrator improvised solutions while maintaining focus on escape and misdirection. The ransom note had been written during the hours he waited in the house, giving him time to discover family financial information and create the elaborate misdirection. The specific bonus amount might have been found in documents or overheard in conversations. This timeline allows for extensive preparation and planning. Hours of waiting in the house would provide opportunity to locate materials, practice the note, and prepare for the kidnapping attempt. The note's length and detail reflect abundant time for composition and revision. This explains the DNA evidence, the unidentified footprint and palm print, and the lack of clear family motive. It accounts for the unusual ransom note as the product of someone with time and specific criminal intent. The physical evidence of possible intruder presence, the boot print, the palm print, the broken window, supports this scenario. Someone with no legitimate reason to be in the house left traces of their presence in the basement where JonBenét's body was found. But this narrative struggles with the insider knowledge required, the risk of spending so much time in an occupied house, and the specific staging elements that seem designed to misdirect investigation rather than simply cover up a crime. The financial information presents particular challenges. John's bonus amount wasn't casually mentioned or easily discoverable. It required access to private documents or intimate family conversations. How would an intruder obtain this data without extensive prior surveillance or inside assistance? Each door opens onto a logical progression of events that makes sense until you examine the details that don't fit. Each theory requires overlooking evidence or accepting unlikely coincidences. The contaminated crime scene destroyed context that might have resolved these contradictions. Officer French's failure to turn on the light in the wine cellar. The hours of foot traffic through potential evidence. The movement of JonBenét's body before documentation. All of these factors removed information that could have pointed definitively toward the truth. The case remains officially open. DNA technology continues to evolve. Genetic genealogy might eventually trace family connections to the unknown profile found on JonBenét's clothing. Or it might determine that the DNA comes from an innocent source and has no connection to her murder. But even if DNA provides answers about identity, questions about motive, method, and timeline may persist. The crime scene contamination in those crucial first hours destroyed context that could have clarified what happened. The adversarial relationship between investigators and family prevented the cooperation that might have resolved contradictions. Technology offers hope, but history suggests caution. Each advance in forensic science has revealed new complexities rather than simple answers. DNA analysis that seemed definitive in 1997 appeared ambiguous by 2003. Touch DNA that seemed conclusive in 2008 remains disputed today. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old when she died. She loved performing, singing in her church choir, and preparing for the children's Christmas pageant she would never get to perform in. She was learning piano and violin. She was excited about the Disney cruise her family had planned. Her childhood interests and activities paint a picture of normal development suddenly and violently interrupted. The pageants that became so central to media coverage represented only one aspect of a full life that included music, church, school, and family activities. Her case became a symbol of investigative failure, media exploitation, and the American fascination with true crime mysteries. She became a name synonymous with questions that seemed to have no satisfactory answers. The transformation from victim to symbol reflects broader cultural phenomena. High-profile crimes become vehicles for exploring social anxieties about child safety, family dysfunction, class privilege, and institutional competence. The actual person at the center becomes secondary to the narratives built around them. But before she was any of those things, she was a child who deserved to be safe in her own home on Christmas night. The evidence remains. The files stay open. The questions persist. Which door do you think leads to the truth? Or is there a third possibility that no one has yet considered? This documentary examines publicly reported information, disputed interpretations, and unresolved questions surrounding the JonBenét Ramsey case. No conclusions about guilt are presented. All individuals mentioned are presumed innocent. The perspectives discussed reflect theories, claims, and interpretations that have appeared in public records, media reporting, and legal proceedings over time. This video is intended for informational and analytical purposes only. It invites viewers to examine the evidence and form their own conclusions.